My daughter is 8 years old, bald, and sitting on our front porch with a piece of chalk in her hand. She's drawing caterpillars on the sidewalk, wobbly ones with too many legs and little hats. She's been home from the hospital for 3 days, which is what we call a good health weekend in our house. Not a vacation, not normalcy, just borrowed time between treatments, and we take every hour of it. Her name is Maya, named after the month she was born, back when the world was simpler. She's small and fast and loud in the specific way that only children who have faced genuinely terrifying things can be loud, like they've decided noise is proof of being alive. She was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 10 months ago. 3rd round of chemotherapy took her hair. On her good days, she wears a navy blue baseball cap because her dad coaches Little League and she inherited the obsession completely. That Saturday morning, she wasn't wearing the cap. It was warm. She was tired. Her mom was right there beside her on the porch steps. She had blue chalk and purple chalk, and she was very focused on getting the caterpillar's legs exactly right. I'm Grant Calloway, 14 years on patrol with the Morrow County Sheriff's Department. Not a rookie, not someone who loses his temper easily. I edge my lawn tight enough that neighbors use it as a reference point. My wife Dina is a licensed practical nurse at the regional hospital. We have 1 daughter, 1 mortgage, and between the 2 of us, 0 patience for people who make life harder than it already is. We live in a planned community called Ridgeline Commons, identical tan houses, white vinyl fencing, a community pool that gets used maybe 6 weeks a year, and a homeowners association that operates with the specific intensity of people who have been given a small amount of authority and have decided to treat it like a national security clearance. Monthly dues, $260. I never missed one, not once, not even during the months we were sleeping in hospital chairs. The HOA president was a woman I'll call Constance Weller. She'd held the position for 5 consecutive years. She drove a white luxury SUV and parked it at a diagonal across 2 spaces every single time, like the parking lot was a personal courtesy extended to her by the universe. She wore her HOA credentials on a lanyard to community events, to the mailbox, presumably to her own kitchen. She had a pattern that the older residents had learned to recognize. Her enforcement complaints had a notable tendency to land on the 3 families of color in the community, on households with visible medical equipment, on the retired veteran who'd built a vegetable garden in his front yard. The language was always clean: community standards, visual coherence, property values. The targeting underneath it was something else entirely. That Saturday, Constance walked past our house during Maya's chalk session. She slowed. She stopped. She looked at my daughter's bare head with a long, deliberate stare that Dina clocked immediately and described to me later as the kind of look that makes you feel like you're being assessed rather than seen. 3 days later, a formal violation notice arrived in our mailbox. Violation code 6.3b, maintaining a visible presence on property frontage in a manner that causes disturbance to the reasonable enjoyment of neighboring residents. There was no mention of chalk. No mention of noise, nothing specific at all, because nothing specific had actually happened. A child sat on her own porch. That was the entire offense. Dina read the notice twice, then she called me at the station. I want to explain something about how I think, because it matters for everything that comes after. My instinct in every situation is process, document, follow the chain, use the system the way it was designed to be used, because that's the only way to make it actually mean something. That instinct doesn't come from naivete. It comes from 14 years of watching what happens when people skip steps. So my first move was not confrontation. My first move was to pull out the HOA's governing documents, all 87 pages, and look up code 6.3b. It existed. It was a real rule. It had been written to address a situation where a resident had been operating a loud outdoor business from his front driveway for several months running. Constance had taken that language and pointed it at my 8-year-old cancer patient drawing caterpillars with sidewalk chalk. I drafted a formal written response, polite, precise, documented. I attached Maya's diagnosis paperwork, her oncologist's name and contact information, and the date of her most recent chemotherapy session. I sent it certified mail and kept the receipt in a folder I labeled simply Weller. 2 weeks passed, no response. At the next HOA board meeting, one that Dina and I missed because Maya had a follow-up appointment, Constance moved to issue a second violation. She framed it in the meeting minutes as a health and safety concern. I know this because our neighbor, a retired civil engineer named Bernard Oakes, was there. Bernard lived in Ridgeline Commons for 19 years. He stood 6'2", spoke in complete sentences at all times, and had the specific energy of a man who had spent 40 decades watching organizations make preventable mistakes and was personally offended every time it happened. He called me that evening and read me the meeting minutes word for word. Then he said, "You know she's done this kind of thing before." I was beginning to understand that I did not know the half of it. Within 48 hours, 2 more neighbors had knocked on our door, with food, with information, and with a quiet, collective anger that had apparently been building for years and had simply been waiting for a moment to organize around. The moment had arrived. What happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, documented, and very, very patient, because the woman on the other side of this had 6 years of practice running this neighborhood like a private fiefdom, and the only thing that actually dismantles that kind of power is someone who knows the rules better than she does. I was that someone, and I hadn't even started yet. But here's the part Constance Weller never accounted for. The call she made to law enforcement about my daughter, the officer who responded to that call was me. She didn't know that when she picked up the phone, and by the time she did find out, it was already in the public record. Stay with me, because the paper trail she helped me build is about to become the most important document in Ridgeline Commons. The call came over my radio on a Tuesday evening. I was parked on the county highway working through a fender bender report, pen in hand, the kind of routine paperwork that fills about 60% of a patrol shift. Dispatch came through with a non-emergency complaint. The address was familiar. It took me about half a second to understand why. It was mine. The language dispatch used was careful, clearly borrowed directly from whoever had called it in. A visually disturbing minor on public-facing property, that was the phrase, visually disturbing, applied to my daughter on her own porch. I set my pen down. I confirmed the address. I said, "Copy, I'll take it." Nobody argued. Non-emergency complaint, my patrol zone, and when my voice goes very quiet and very flat, it tends to discourage pushback. 4 minutes to drive home. The evening air came through the cruiser window, cut grass and something sweet from down the block. Dina had been baking before her shift. I could smell it from the street. I parked. Maya was on the front porch, chalk in hand. The caterpillar now had a friend, a blocky creature that might have been a dinosaur or might have been a very determined dog. The artistic interpretation was genuinely open. I respected the ambiguity. I climbed out of the cruiser in full uniform, walked to my own front door, knocked because I was responding as an officer, and I was going to do this exactly right. Maya opened the door, looked at my uniform, looked at my face, and said, "Dad, did someone call the police on our house?" "Yes," I said. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "That's pretty weird," and went back to her chalk. I spent the next several minutes on that porch conducting the most thorough documentation of sidewalk chalk art in the history of Morrow County. I examined both creatures, I noted their features, and then I wrote my incident report with the precision of someone who understood, even in that moment, that a correctly filed document is a form of protection. My report read as follows. Responding officer arrived at the listed address and found a juvenile, approximately 8 years of age, engaged in chalk artwork on private property frontage. Juvenile exhibited no threatening behavior. No violation of any municipal, county, or state ordinance was observed. Complaint assessed as unfounded. Case closed. Case number included. Submitted into the public record of the Morrow County Sheriff's Department. Constance was informed that the responding officer had found no violation. This outcome did not satisfy her. The following evening she called the non-emergency line again. Same address, same language, visually disturbing. Dispatch sent Renata Fulton, 11-year veteran, 4 kids of her own, the expression of a woman who has personally cataloged every category of human absurdity and maintains a running internal list. Renata arrived, spoke with Dina for about 3 minutes, then called me on my personal phone. She said 3 words, "You know Weller?" I said, "I'm learning." Renata's incident report was, if anything, more thorough than mine. Second complaint filed at the same address by the same complainant. No ordinance violation observed. Pattern of contact noted. That phrase, pattern of contact, is not decorative language in a police report. It is a formal flag. It means a responding officer has documented that the same individual keeps calling about the same address and keeps being wrong. Constance Weller had just created an official, time-stamped, publicly accessible record of filing repeated unfounded complaints against a household containing a sick child. She did not know that yet. Across the street, Bernard had already told 3 neighbors. 2 doors down, a woman named Simone Carver, whose teenage son mowed our lawn for free during Maya's hospital stays, had told 4 more, and a retired paralegal named Greta Palms, who lived at the far end of the cul-de-sac and had spent 28 years in civil litigation, had been watching from her driveway the evening Renata arrived. She sent Simone a text message immediately. Does he know about the Fair Housing Act? The neighborhood was beginning to move, quietly, carefully, in the specific direction of people who have had enough. What happened next is the part where Constance made her most significant miscalculation. Deciding that direct tactics hadn't worked, she went public. She posted to the Ridgeline Commons private community group online. She didn't use our names, she was too practiced for that. She referred to a situation on the street involving community standards and expressed concern for neighborhood well-being and invited residents who shared her concerns to reach out to the board. She received responses, 14 of them. 11 were angry at her. She either didn't read them carefully or didn't care, which told me something important about how she'd maintained power for 5 years. She'd never had to care what people thought, because nobody had ever organized well enough to matter. That was about to change. At the next board meeting, she tabled a motion to formally amend HOA rules to require that residents with visible medical conditions obtain a board variance before using their front porch. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. Visible medical conditions, variance, front porch. 2 of her own board allies went silent when she said it out loud. The motion was tabled, but the fact that she had proposed it was captured in the meeting minutes, which were a matter of record and which Bernard had photographed before he walked out the door. Everything was always in the minutes. That was her greatest vulnerability, and she had never once noticed it. The folder labeled Weller was getting thicker every week, and I hadn't even met Greta Palms yet. What she was about to bring to my kitchen table was going to change everything, because while Constance had been filing complaints, a retired paralegal had been reading the founding documents of Ridgeline Commons, and she had found something buried in Section 11 that Constance apparently had never once read. That conversation is coming, and when you hear what Greta found, you'll understand why the very foundation Constance had been building on for 5 years was never as solid as she believed. Greta Palms knocked on my door on a Wednesday evening, carrying a legal pad, a pen she clicked with the rhythmic focus of someone who thinks best under minor, repetitive motion, and the energy of a person who has spent nearly 3 decades preparing other people's cases and is absolutely delighted to finally have one of her own. She had read the HOA's governing documents, all of them, not the condensed 4-page handbook Constance distributed to new homeowners, the actual founding documents, the original Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions filed when Ridgeline Commons was built, plus every amendment, every addendum, and every financial disclosure the association had produced in the past 4 years. She handed me a 6-page summary memo at Bernard's kitchen table. Bernard provided coffee in a thermos that appeared to have been designed for industrial use. 3 things stood out. First, Constance had been approving expenditures above her authorized spending limit without a board vote. The threshold was clear in the governing documents: no single expenditure over $2,500 without full board approval. Greta had identified 11 payments over that amount, totaling just under $13,000, paid to a landscaping company called Summit Grounds. Summit Grounds was owned and operated by Constance's nephew. Second, the meeting minutes contained discrepancies, motions appearing in the written record that had never been put to an actual vote. Greta had cross-referenced the minutes against Bernard's personal notes from meetings he had attended and found 6 separate instances of divergence going back nearly 3 years. Third, and this was the one that made me set down my coffee, the variance motion Constance had proposed, the one requiring residents with visible medical conditions to obtain board approval before using their front porch, would, if passed, almost certainly constitute a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Let me explain why that matters. The Fair Housing Act, 42 U.S.C. Section 3604, prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of disability. Cancer qualifies as a disability under the Act. Attempting to regulate a child cancer patient's use of her own front porch is not a community standards issue. It is a federal civil rights issue, and it can be reported directly to the Department of Housing and Urban Development at no cost to the person filing. Greta had already drafted the complaint. But here is the detail that made our position unusually strong. Because I was the responding officer on both of Constance's police calls, my official incident reports and Renata Fulton's corroborating report were already part of the public record of the Morrow County Sheriff's Department. A law enforcement officer's formally documented observation of a pattern of discriminatory targeting attached to a federal housing complaint is not something an HOA's attorney easily dismisses in a procedural filing. We sent the certified letter to the HOA's professional management company first. I noted the pending federal complaint, the documented pattern of unfounded police reports, and copied the HOA's insurance carrier on the correspondence. Within 48 hours, the management company sent a representative to meet with the full board. Bernard described Constance's expression when she learned about the HUD filing as a woman who has just discovered the floor isn't where she thought it was. Then Greta showed me what she'd found in Section 11 of the original founding document, the actual founding document, not the handbook. Paragraph 3, buried language that had apparently never been referenced at any board meeting in recent memory. No amendment to these covenants may be adopted that restricts the use or enjoyment of private property by residents in a manner inconsistent with applicable federal law, including but not limited to the Fair Housing Act. Read that again. Every escalating amendment Constance had pushed through, every selective enforcement action, every violation notice built on the theory that she could dictate how residents used their own property, it had all been constructed on a legal foundation that the original document explicitly prohibited overriding. She didn't just lack the moral authority to do what she had done, she may have lacked the legal authority from the very beginning. Greta looked at me across Bernard's kitchen table and said quietly, "Every violation notice your family received might be void on its face." Simone Carver's brother-in-law, a licensed CPA named David Carver, who specialized in association financial audits, had by this point completed his review of the HOA's public financial disclosures. The unauthorized expenditures to Summit grounds were clear and documented. He prepared a formal demand letter addressed to the HOA's board as a corporate entity, requiring a full accounting of all expenditures over $2,500 in the past 4 years and the return of unauthorized funds to the HOA's reserve account. The legal elegance of this move was the trap inside it. If the board returned the money, they would formally admit the expenditures were unauthorized, which opened Constance to a removal vote. If they refused, they could be sued for breach of fiduciary duty, and they would lose. We had 3 tracks running simultaneously and a neighborhood that now included a retired paralegal, a licensed CPA, a 19-year resident with documented HOA records going back to 2019, and a county deputy who had filed her own corroborating incident report and attended our planning sessions in her personal time because she had 4 children and a specific kind of fury that only activates in situations like this one. I did not celebrate. I told Dina everything when she got home from her shift. She went quiet for a moment, then made me eat dinner because I had not eaten since noon. Then she asked, "What do we do with it all?" I said, "We wait until she does one more thing, then we use everything at once." We didn't have to wait long. The 3rd violation notice arrived 3 days later. Constance had photographed Maya's chalk mural from the sidewalk and filed it as evidence of an aesthetic guideline violation. The caterpillar had 31 legs by then and a sun hat. Its companion, the dinosaur dog, had acquired a scarf. She had photographed it, filed paperwork about it, and somehow still believed she was winning. The annual meeting was 3 weeks away, and what she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that we had already collected the signatures of 19 households for a member petition to add 3 agenda items she had never planned for. The paper trail she had spent months building was about to be laid out in front of 60 of her neighbors, a county deputy, a reporter from the Morrow County Gazette, and a retired paralegal who had been waiting 28 years for a case exactly like this one. The preparation is almost complete. Part 4 is where everything goes on the record, in the open, in front of witnesses. And the moment Constance Weller walks into that community room and sees the crowd, something is going to shift in her face that nobody in that neighborhood will ever forget. The Ridgeline Commons Community Center is a single-story beige room attached to the pool complex. Fluorescent lighting, rows of folding chairs, a folding table at the front for the board. On a normal year, maybe 12 or 15 people showed up for the annual meeting, sat through the treasurer's report, approved the routine budget items, and went home within the hour. That evening, every chair was filled before the meeting started. People stood along the walls. The room smelled like burnt coffee from a percolator that had not been properly cleaned in what I estimated to be several years, and faint chlorine drifting in from the pool next door. Constance arrived first, blazer, lanyard. She had parked the SUV in its usual diagonal configuration across two spaces. She walked in, looked at the room, and for the first time in 5 years of HOA meetings, something in her expression shifted. Not fear, not yet. More like the specific disorientation of a person who has walked into a space they expected to control and found the layout completely rearranged. In the back row, a reporter named Opal Drummond from the Morrow County Gazette sat with a fresh legal pad. Opal had covered local government for 17 years. She had asked the room for permission to record the proceedings before the meeting was called to order. 51 hands went up, 2 did not. The recording began. Renata Fulton was in the third row in a gray cardigan and jeans. She looked like someone's neighbor, which she was. She was also a county deputy with 11 years on the job and her own incident report in the folder I was carrying. Constance called the meeting to order. She had prepared a compressed agenda designed to bury the financial items under routine business and push community concerns to the end, after she calculated people would be tired and ready to leave. It was a reasonable strategy. It required the room to cooperate. Bernard Oakes raised his hand immediately. Constance recognized him. Bernard moved to restructure the agenda, citing the governing document section and paragraph number from memory, because he had been reading HOA documents since 2019, and he knew them as well as anyone in the room. Constance said the motion was out of order. Greta Palms from the fourth row recited the exact provision allowing a majority of members present to vote on agenda restructuring. The vote, 44 in favor, 3 opposed. The agenda was restructured. I stood up. Civilian clothes, clean shirt, dark pants, no uniform because I was there as a resident, not as an officer, and I wanted that distinction to be absolutely clear. I had the folder. I went through it the way I have testified in court dozens of times, methodically, without drama, letting the documents carry the weight. The original violation notice, the certified mail receipt proving my written response had been delivered and signed for, my incident report filed as the responding officer to Constance's police complaint, assessing it as unfounded, Renata's incident report filed independently, noting a documented pattern of contact, the HUD complaint reference number confirming an active federal fair housing investigation. I placed each document on the table at the front of the room. Then I said, the officer who responded to the complaint filed about my daughter was me. I am that officer. I drove my county cruiser to my own address, walked to my own front door, and documented a complaint about my own child, a child receiving treatment for leukemia, as unfounded. Twice. I want that on the record of this meeting. The room was very quiet. Constance said this was an HOA meeting, not a courtroom. I said, you're right. In a courtroom, you'd have a proper attorney. David Carver came forward next. He spoke the language of financial documentation the way I speak incident reports, precisely, without filler, in a register that makes numbers feel both inevitable and damning. $13,000 in unauthorized expenditures, 11 instances, each one documented. The vendor was owned by Constance's nephew, operating under a contract that had never been put to a board vote because the meeting minutes showing that vote did not exist because the vote had never happened. David asked Constance to identify the board minutes approving each expenditure. She could not, because they didn't exist. One of the board members, the one who had been quietly texting Simone Carver updates throughout every emergency session for 3 weeks, made a motion to censure the board president and freeze all HOA expenditures pending a full independent audit. It passed 4-1. Then Greta read the removal provision. 2/3 members present. She called for the motion. Bernard made it. Simone seconded it. The vote was by show of hands. They went up around the room, one after another, steadily, without drama. 38 hands. 2/3 required 34. Constance Weller was removed as HOA president by the neighbors she had governed by intimidation for 5 years. She stood. She said something. I am leaving that deliberately unrecorded because whatever it was, it did not land. Nobody wrote it down. She walked out. The SUV left the parking lot. Outside, the chalk mural was still on the sidewalk under the porch light, 31 legs on the original caterpillar, a sun hat, and beside it, in careful, wobbly 8-year-old letters, Brave. What came after that meeting was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of what the neighborhood built from the wreckage. And what Constance did in the weeks before that meeting, the smear campaign, the cease and desist letter, the attempt to postpone the annual meeting entirely, needs to be documented too, because it shows exactly how someone operating from a position of institutional abuse responds when the walls start closing in. She didn't go quietly. She tried 4 separate moves to stop what was coming. Every single one failed, and the way they failed tells you everything you need to know about the difference between authority that is legitimate and authority that is performed.
Let me go back 3 weeks, because what Constance did between the HUD filing and the annual meeting deserves its own accounting. When the management company notified the board of the pending federal fair housing complaint, Constance went very still and very quiet, according to someone who was in the room when she received the news. Not the quiet of a person absorbing a consequence, the quiet of calculation. She made 4 moves, every one of them failed. The way they failed is instructive. Her first move was a smear. She located a disciplinary note in my employment file from 2016, nothing fabricated. She was too careful for outright lies, but selectively presented. The note documented that I had submitted a use of force report 2 days past the required deadline. What she omitted, I was at the hospital with Maya when the deadline passed. The note had been in my file, fully resolved, for 7 years. She sent excerpts to 2 board members framed as concerns about Officer Calloway's professional conduct. Then she apparently sent those same materials to Opal Drummond at the Gazette. Opal had covered local government for 17 years. She recognized selective document framing the way an experienced carpenter recognizes a stripped screw, immediately and with a specific kind of tired irritation. She called me to ask about the note. I explained the full context in about 4 minutes. Opal said she would verify everything independently. She did. The smear evaporated. And now Opal Drummond had personally witnessed an attempt to intimidate a source before a major public meeting. That detail went into her notes. Reporters keep notes about everything. Constance's second move was legal. Her personal attorney, a general practice lawyer who primarily handled estate planning and residential real estate closings, sent me a cease and desist letter. The theory was that by coordinating with other residents to bring complaints, I was engaging in tortious interference with the HOA's governance functions. Greta read it at my kitchen table. She laughed, not cruelly, involuntarily. The specific laugh of someone who has processed 30 years of creative legal threats and can assess their structural integrity in about 15 seconds. Residents coordinating to exercise their rights under the HOA's own bylaws is not tortious interference, it is governance, exactly the kind the documents were designed to protect. The letter had no valid legal foundation and would have dissolved the moment anyone challenged it. I kept it anyway, because I kept everything, and because a cease and desist letter sent to discourage a federal complainant from proceeding might later demonstrate a pattern of intimidation. A cease and desist letter is not a court order. It carries no legal force on its own. If a qualified legal professional determines it has no valid foundation, it can be disregarded. What matters is documenting that it was sent. Her third move was administrative. As board president, Constance attempted to postpone the annual meeting by 2 months, citing extraordinary governance circumstances. The problem, the governing documents specify the annual meeting must occur within a defined 30-day window. Postponing outside that window required a vote of the members she was trying to avoid. Greta filed a formal objection with the management company the same afternoon. The management company, which was by this point acutely aware of its own liability exposure, confirmed within 24 hours that the meeting would proceed as scheduled. Her fourth move was her most audacious. 6 days before the annual meeting, she called an emergency board session with 48 hours' notice, the minimum the bylaws permitted, with a single agenda item: a vote to dissolve and reconstitute the enforcement committee under new rules granting the board president unilateral enforcement authority. No board review, no appeal process, one person, final decision. In a single vote, she could have made herself structurally untouchable inside the HOA's own framework. Bernard received the emergency notice in his mailbox on a Tuesday morning. He stared at it for approximately 10 seconds. Then he called Greta. Greta called me. I called the management company.
The management company contacted Constance's attorney and explained that an emergency meeting called for the explicit purpose of eliminating governance oversight did not qualify as an emergency under any reasonable reading of the bylaws, and that certifying such a vote would expose the management company to its own liability. The meeting dissolved before it happened. 2 days before the annual meeting, I received a visitor. One of the quieter board members, a retired accountant named Frank, who I had always found decent, knocked on my door around 7 in the evening holding a manila envelope and wearing the expression of a man executing an errand he had not fully endorsed. The board, he explained, had authorized him to present a settlement offer. All 3 violation notices would be formally rescinded. Our HOA dues would be reduced by 50% for the remainder of our residency. We would receive a written letter of apology. In exchange, we would withdraw the HUD complaint and take no further action. I looked at the envelope. I did not take it. I said, "Frank, this stopped being about us some time ago." He drove away, still holding it. I called Greta immediately. She advised that a settlement offer made using HOA resources to induce the withdrawal of an active federal complaint might itself constitute improper use of HOA funds and, depending on framing, a potential attempt to obstruct a federal process. I documented the conversation, time, content, exact words as best I could recall. It went into the folder. The folder was very thick by now. The night before the annual meeting, I sat at the kitchen table and went through every document one final time. Not because I needed to, because preparation is the only thing that ever makes me genuinely calm before something difficult. I checked the document order, verified the HUD reference number, confirmed that Opal was still coming. Then I went to look in on Maya. She was asleep. The railroad spike that Bernard had given her, telling her with complete seriousness that it was the strongest thing he owned and he felt she should have it, was on her nightstand next to her baseball glove. She'd named her stuffed animals after caterpillars in her mural. There were 12 of them now, arranged in a specific order she would explain at length if you asked. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I wrote one line in my notebook, not for the meeting, just for myself. She called the police on my sick child. I was the cop. I closed the notebook. Everything that came after that meeting was something Constance never saw coming, not because we were louder or angrier, but because we were patient and prepared, and we showed up. 38 hands in a fluorescent-lit beige room next to a pool nobody uses. But the meeting wasn't the ending. What the neighborhood built afterwards is the part that actually matters, and what happened to the money, to the fund it became, to Maya's mural and the community that grew around it, that's where this story finds its real shape.
Within 60 days of the annual meeting, the following things happened. All 3 violation notices issued to our family were formally rescinded by the new interim HOA president, Bernard Oakes, elected at a reconstitution session 3 days after the annual meeting. Bernard accepted the position with the resigned but genuine energy of a man who has decided a job needs doing and has run out of reasons to let someone else do it. His first act as president was to replace the condensed resident handbook with the actual governing documents, all 87 pages, made available to every household in print and digital format. The HUD investigation proceeded. The HOA, now represented by its own attorney rather than Constance's, cooperated fully. The finding documented a systemic pattern of enforcement based on disability status. The HOA entered a voluntary compliance agreement that included updated enforcement procedures, mandatory fair housing training for all board members, and an explicit written provision protecting residents with documented medical conditions from selective enforcement actions. David Carver completed the financial audit. The $13,000 in unauthorized expenditures was referred to the HOA's legal counsel. Constance received a civil demand for repayment. Her attorney advised her to settle. She did. Constance listed her house within 90 days of the annual meeting. The SUV was not seen in the neighborhood again. Bernard's first substantive motion as board president was to create a one-page resident rights document for every new homeowner welcome packet. Greta wrote it in a single afternoon. 3 things: how to file a Fair Housing Act complaint at HUD.gov, what constitutes authorized HOA expenditure, and how to request a financial accounting, and the exact signature threshold needed to force a member vote and remove a board officer for cause. 3 neighboring communities requested copies before the month was out. The money recovered from the civil settlement became the seed funding for the Ridgeline Commons Community Assistance Fund, matched by a neighborhood fundraiser that Simone and Greta organized over 2 weekends. The fund's purpose was direct financial support for any Ridgeline Commons family facing medical hardship, transparent records, public annual accounting, and elected committee with rotating membership. Exactly the governance structure the HOA had always been designed to have and had never actually practiced. The first disbursement was 3 months of HOA dues relief for our family, approved unanimously. The second disbursement was a grant to a regional childhood cancer family support organization that Dina had worked with through the hospital. The third went to help a family 2 streets over whose father had been diagnosed with a spinal condition that spring and who had quietly stopped mowing their lawn because he could no longer stand long enough to finish it. Nobody filed a violation notice about the lawn. Now, the part I need you to understand is why I am telling this story and what I want you to take from it. I am not telling it because we won. Winning is not the lesson. The lesson is in what made winning possible. I have worked in law enforcement for 14 years. I have watched people get run over by institutions, by systems, by the specific cruelty of small authority wielded without accountability. I have also watched people successfully push back. The difference between those two groups is almost never resources. It is almost never connections. It is almost never luck. The difference is documentation and knowledge of process. Every certified mail receipt, every photographed document, every incident report filed with a case number, every governing document read from cover to cover, every financial disclosure requested and reviewed, every meeting attended in folding chairs under fluorescent light. Constance had operated for 5 years on a single core assumption, that the documents were too long, that the processes were too complicated, that showing up to 4-hour meetings was too tedious, that filing a federal complaint was too intimidating. She was not wrong about most people. She was wrong about the people on our street. Power exercised without accountability is not actually power. It is a performance of power that depends entirely on the audience believing the performance is real. The moment you pull out the governing documents, file the complaint, show up with your neighbors and ask for the motion to be recorded in the minutes, the performance stops working. What she had was not authority. It was the assumption of authority maintained by the exhaustion of everyone around her. A few things I want you to know if you ever need them. Filing a Fair Housing Act complaint costs nothing and takes less than an hour at HUD.gov. If a housing authority, an HOA, a landlord, or any housing-related entity takes discriminatory action based on disability, race, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, or several other protected categories, HUD investigates. The process is designed to be accessible. HOA financial disclosures are public documents you can request at any time. If funds are being spent without proper board authorization, that is a breach of fiduciary duty and is recoverable through civil action. The threshold for unauthorized expenditure will be in your governing documents. A cease and desist letter is not a court order. A properly qualified legal professional can assess it in minutes, document that it was received. When a board officer acts outside their legal authority and other board members ratify those actions without objection, personal civil liability can follow the individual board members, not just the association. And the meeting minutes are always in the record. Everything is always in the record, which means everything you say and do in a governance process becomes evidence. That works against people who abuse the system. It works for people who use it correctly. I took the folder labeled Weller out of my filing cabinet on an evening in late October. I looked at it for a moment, then I put it in the recycling bin. I didn't go into this wanting to destroy someone. I went into it because my daughter drew a caterpillar on the sidewalk and someone decided that was a problem worth calling the authorities over. And I know what an unfounded complaint looks like. I have spent 14 years documenting them. The right response was not to let it go. The right response was to know the rules, use the process, and show up. 3 weeks after the annual meeting, Maya had her 6-month oncology review. Her counts were good. Her oncologist, a careful man who had learned through years of practice not to make promises, used the word encouraging. He said it the way people who mean things say words. Maya still wears her baseball cap. The caterpillar named Brave still has 31 legs and a sun hat on the sidewalk, refreshed every few weeks in new chalk by a kid who is small and fast and impossibly loud, and who is, by every measure that counts, still here. Simone's son mows around the mural every week without being asked.
By the end of September, the artwork stretched from our front walk to the edges of 3 neighboring driveways and included, by Maya's count, 43 creatures. Nobody filed a complaint. The porch light is on, the chalk is on the sidewalk, and if you are sitting right now in a situation where someone with a clipboard and a lanyard has made you feel like you have no recourse, I need you to hear this clearly. You have recourse. Read the governing documents, request the financial disclosures, document everything with a timestamp. Find your Greta, your Bernard, your Simone, file the complaint, show up to the meeting. 38 hands, that's all it took to end 5 years of institutional abuse. Power only holds over people who believe they have no options. The moment you understand your options, the performance ends. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you have ever had a housing authority, an HOA, or a landlord come after you for something this unreasonable, I want to hear it in the comments, because your story matters too, and so does knowing you are not alone in it.